We're recording now. There we go.
This meeting is
Perfect,
being
okay.
recorded.
Great. All right. Well, good evening, everyone. And thanks for joining us for this very interesting event about industrial logging, biodiversity, and the climate emergency. My name is Sue McKenzie, and I'm a founder of Climate Action Muskoka. Our group is appropriately located in the riding of our current Minister of Natural Resources and Forestry here in Ontario. The other two organizations who are sponsoring this event are Seniors for Climate Action Now and Environment Haliburton. We have had a great response for this webinar, showing that interest in how industrial logging practices impact climate is of particular relevance at this time when Canada is on fire. And I guess a lot of us will be out on the street tomorrow trying to emphasize that we are burning. I'd like to ask you to stay muted, as any noise from participants can distract from the presentation. Also, we would ask that you only use the chat function for questions of the speaker once the presentation begins. This event will be recorded and is being recorded, and it will be posted on the Environment Haliburton, Seniors for Climate Action Now, and Climate Action Muskoka websites once it's edited. I would now like to introduce Susan Hay, President of Environment Haliburton, who will give our land acknowledgement. Over to you, Susan.
Thanks, Sue. This acknowledgement of the First Peoples on whose traditional territories we live and work shows recognition of and respect for Indigenous peoples. Recognition and respect are essential elements of establishing healthy reciprocal relations and reconciliation. We at Environment Haliburton, Seniors for Climate Action Now, and Climate Action Muskoka will continue to strive to be active allies with our Indigenous peoples across Canada, supporting their crucial work on the issues of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, environmental degradation due to resource development policies, and the need for major public investments in Indigenous education, healthcare, social services, water infrastructure, and housing. As settlers, recognition of the contributions and historic importance of Indigenous peoples must also be clearly connected to our collective commitment to make the promise and challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our communities. Back to you, Sue.
Thanks, Susan. Tonight is the second in a four-part series on resource extraction. Over the next few months, we'll explore the dimensions of and assess some of the consequences of an economic model fueled by extraction. We will do so by examining four extraction industries: mining, forestry, industrial agriculture, and aggregates. Our focus will largely be Ontario, but the lessons learned will have broader implications. So, why a series on extraction? In part because we don't have the luxury of dealing with one crisis at a time. We are in a period of accelerating multiple crises. We know the dimensions of the climate crisis and the urgency by which we need to act. We know that the climate crisis is the cause of and a consequence of a deeper ecological crisis. We also know that the major driver behind the climate crisis, the major threat of ecological collapse, is an economic system hell-bent on generating endless growth and never-ending profits for a tiny group of the world's population. And we know that the fallout, depleted resources, distorted economies, degraded commons, dispossessed peoples are among the crises we need to address. In the four-part series, we're looking at two non-renewable resources, mineral and non-mineral mining, and two renewables that, because of the huge scale of extraction, are becoming non-renewable. That's forests and soils. Mineral mining, because that is what will drive a wind, water, and solar energy transformation. Aggregates, because of the concrete, highway expansions, and relentless urban sprawl. Industrial agriculture, because it has mined and depleted the soil. and timber extraction, because it has turned our forests from carbon sinks to carbon sources, and because of the paramount impacts on Indigenous peoples and on Indigenous rights. Tonight's session on industrial logging is set within a context of how extractive logging practices are putting the climate and biodiversity at serious risk in Ontario and elsewhere in Canada. A context of incomplete measurement of greenhouse gas emissions relating to our forests, and in light of the fact that logging is one of Canada's highest emitting sectors. It is the hope of our three sponsoring groups that in learning about these issues together, we will be better prepared to propose alternatives. To introduce this evening's speaker, I'll turn to Terry Moore, a member of both Environment Halliburton and Seniors for Climate Action Now, who has agreed to moderate tonight's session. Terry?
Thank you, Sue. So just before I introduce Michael Polanyi, I want to just ask for your cooperation with respect to putting questions into chat. When we come to the end of Michael's presentation, I'll be calling on two first questioners to begin the process, one from Climate Action Muskoka and one from SCAN. And then I'll go to the chat box and pretty much try to take questions that have been put there in sequence. We're expecting a large number of people today, so we can't do this verbally, but so we're going to try to curate this through chat. And I might try to put together some questions if they're on similar themes, amalgamate them, and so on. We plan to end tonight's session by about 8:30, depending on the number of questions that are still in chat by the time we get to that moment in the evening. So if you could start putting at any time when a question arises, you think of it during Michael's presentation, please put it in chat, and we'll attempt to try to get to as many of them as possible in the time that we have available. Okay, so with respect to our speaker tonight, Michael is an experienced campaigner with a background in policy research, advocacy, and community organizing. Since arriving at Nature Canada in 2021, Michael has led research and advocacy to advance more transparent and accurate government reporting of logging-related greenhouse gas emissions, and advised on and advocated for the incorporation of nature in Canada's adaptation strategy. Before joining Nature Canada, Michael coordinated climate engagement and advocacy work at the Toronto Environmental Alliance. Prior to that, he was a social and environmental policy researcher at Queen's Park, National Anti-Poverty Program Coordinator at Kairos, and a community engagement worker with the Children's Aid Society of Toronto. He has led and supported numerous peace, justice, and environmental campaigns, from helping win a student referendum to boycott South African products at McMaster University in the mid-1980s, to securing the City of Toronto's climate emergency declaration in 2019. Michael received a doctorate in environmental studies from York University in 2000, and he explored the possibilities and limitations of multi-stakeholder change processes. Please welcome Michael Polanyi to this event tonight. Michael, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you for the introduction, and really nice to be with you this evening. Thanks for taking time to join, and it's good to see some familiar faces from activism over the years, and I want to really appreciate the work that your organizations are doing to bring attention to climate crisis. And I think that seniors, I know not all of you are seniors, but I consider myself pretty well a senior. I think that we have an important role to play, obviously, as people who have benefited from a society that has become drastically unsustainable for future generations. And I think that seniors do have access, resources, and connections, and a lot of power when we come together. So I'm really glad that SCAN, Seniors for Climate Action Now, and the other co-sponsors are engaging, and hopefully we can I'm really keen on hearing from you, your thoughts about the challenges that we face, both on the climate side and the biodiversity extinction, species extinction side, when it comes to logging and other sectors. And hopefully we can have a good discussion about ways to act together to bring about a more sustainable relationship with the natural world. I should say I'm in what's now known as Ottawa, unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. And as was mentioned in the introduction, certainly when we're talking about forests, we're talking about Canada's boreal forest, we're talking about the home of over 600 Indigenous communities. And when we're thinking about this transition that needs to take place in society from, as you've talked about, the unsustainable extraction of resources to coming back into balance with nature, Mother Nature, clearly that struggle for that transformation is linked to and dependent on the advancement of Indigenous sovereignty, Indigenous rights, and Indigenous leadership and Indigenous ways of knowing in terms of informing how we walk on this planet and in this country. So I will share some slides. Just 1 second. Let's see. And really, I mean, I should say that I've been immersed in the world of logging and forestry for 2.5 years. So I didn't spend my lifetime studying forests and the forestry sector. As was mentioned, I've worked on a range of different social justice and climate issues over the years. But really, since I joined Nature Canada, we've spent a lot of time thinking about the climate impacts of logging. And the reason we've done that is we believe that there's a real lack of scrutiny and transparency when it comes to the climate impacts of this sector of the economy. In fact, as was mentioned in the introduction, we believe that the emissions from logging are on par with the emissions from other high emitting sectors. And we think that the logging sector is kind of the last large industrial sector in the Canadian economy that has kind of been able to portray itself as low carbon, sustainable, when in fact quite the opposite is true. So that's kind of, I think, the essence of the work that I want to share. I will talk a bit about biodiversity. I'll talk a bit about primary forests, talk a bit about how the biodiversity and climate crises are linked, and really do want to end by thinking about and hearing your ideas about how we move forward on this issue, because certainly we've been working for the last couple of years talking to government officials, climate think tanks, Indigenous groups, health groups, a range of different stakeholders about the problem of lack of transparency and lack of accurate reporting of logging emissions. And I think we've made some progress, but I think it's a real challenge to get the Canadian government to actually acknowledge that logging is a high emitting sector and to put in place policies to support the transition of that sector to a lower carbon footprint, and to protect forests in Canada, which are so critical to our survival. So just a word about Nature Canada, one of the oldest conservation organizations in Canada. It's been around for about 80 years. It's been involved in the creation of many national parks, provincial parks as well. I think we've helped protect over 100 100 million acres of important ecosystems. We do a lot of work to engage, support more equitable access to nature, recognizing that Black, Indigenous, and people of color have systematic barriers to accessing nature. So this idea of discovering nature more equitably across the Canadian population is part of what we've been working on. And then we've been working a lot recently to hold the federal government to account on some of its, I would say, bold commitments around nature in terms of protecting 30% of land and water by 2030, in terms of planting 2 billion trees by 2030, in terms of investing in nature-based climate solutions, which I'll talk about a little bit more. And most recently, in terms of committing to halt and reverse nature loss, halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. And the challenge, I think, with this government is strong targets and timelines, but actually getting the government to make the investments and put in place the programs and the actions to realize those targets. That's going to be our challenge collectively, to hold our government to account on its promises. Nature Canada is really, we're based in Ottawa. We work with government officials from Ottawa, but I think the power of that we have really relates to we're picture groups, climate groups, over 1,300 groups, communicate to them when the key moments are to influence federal policy. I see my internet is unstable. I'm sorry about that. So we communicate to them key moments to influence policy, and they engage with their local MPs. And really, there's a power in that many groups being able to come together in a unified voice to push for stronger action to protect and restore nature. Nature Canada has increasingly worked to support Indigenous communities in advancing protected areas. One example is working with the Cree Nation along the shorelines of James Bay to identify important bird areas and to advance protected areas along their territory. And another example is working with the Sikitawak Nation in Saskatchewan over the past couple of years, supporting them in developing provincial support and community support for a potential protected area in Northwest Saskatchewan. You're very engaged on climate change. I'm sure some of you are very engaged on the biodiversity crisis. I think that we've seen advances. I mean, I've been working on climate issues for 20 years, 25 years, and I think that in the last 3 or 4 years, we have seen a sea change in terms of public engagement, in terms of governments no longer being able to kind of ignore the crisis. I mean, I think it's rare that we've seen an election where climate change was one of the top 3 issues, which I think was the case in 2019. And I think that we've had challenges in the last year or two with the economic crisis that people are facing, with inflation, with housing crisis, with healthcare crisis, and so on. And we have this, these multiple crises, and they're all important. And I think that in some ways we've lost a bit of momentum on climate change, but I think that, the drastic sort of impacts, we've already talked about the fires, and I think tragic as they are, I think that this may cause a sea change in terms of now millions of Canadians being directly affected, their health being affected, having to, tens of thousands of people being evacuated. This is, I think, for many of us, some of it, we've been taking clean air for granted, and this summer we're seeing that that's no longer the case. And I heard today, I think government officials were saying that 7.7 million hectares have burned so far, and in a very short period. My understanding is the total forested area in Canada is 360 million hectares. So we're talking about 1/50th, 2% of all the forests in Canada have burned in the last several weeks. Anyway, I think that we need to hold our government to account for the massive fires. And I know that already there's been a plug for the events that are taking place across the country through 350.org. Canada is burning events. So this is an opportunity that we have to push and hold to account our leaders on this. Sorry, that was a bit of a sideline, but I think the point here is that there's been a lot of attention to climate change, and I think increasingly there's a recognition that we're in a sixth extinction crisis, first extinction crisis in 65 million years. I think that COP 15 being in Canada brought a lot of attention to this biodiversity crisis. And so I think that increasingly we're recognizing that these two crises are linked and have some of the same driving causes, and that there's also some common solutions to both crises. So I won't spend a lot of time on this, but you're probably aware of the numbers: 1 million species at risk globally. Our extinction rate today is thousands of times what the natural extinction rate is. Massive declines in wildlife populations, and massive degradation and destruction of natural ecosystems and habitats. And Canada, we know, is so critical in terms of having so much of nature and biodiversity within our borders. And so we have a particular responsibility to be global leaders in terms of protecting this decline and the decline in critical habitats, or the destruction and degradation of critical habitats in Canada continuing. The recent assessment found that 20% of species that have been assessed are at some level of risk in Canada. So I mentioned that climate change drives biodiversity loss, and biodiversity loss drives climate change, but also that the degradation and destruction of ecosystems drives both of these crises. That's the key message here. So Canada's commitment and the global commitment to halt and reverse nature loss by 2030 is a critical opportunity to stop the destruction of these natural ecosystems in Canada. From a carbon perspective, clearly we need to phase out fossil fuels and the burning of fossil fuels as quickly as possible. This 60 gigaton number, 60 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions emitted each year from the burning of fossil fuels largely. We need to address that. But I think increasingly there's a recognition that unless we protect carbon-rich ecosystems, we won't succeed in reducing atmospheric levels of carbon. and this slide really just shows how large the fluxes are, how large the emissions and the removals are from natural plants, from soils and from oceans. And if we start to, as we are, degrade these land and ocean systems, we're not going to be able to tackle the climate crisis. So that's why there's a lot of talk about so-called nature-based climate solutions or nature-based solutions, is simply the recognition that we have to protect, better manage, and restore wetlands, grasslands, forests, coastal areas, if we are going to cut our emissions in Canada and cut emissions globally. Nature United wrote a nice paper reviewing something like 25 different nature-based climate solutions in Canada. They kind of quantified how much in terms of additional carbon sequestration could be achieved in the different main landscapes where nature-based solutions can take place. And they found that there's a potential for about 80 megaton, an 80 megaton contribution towards carbon sequestration, a contribution towards Canada's 2030 emission reduction target. So it could take us, if we adopted these nature-based solutions, that could take us a third of the way to our 40% reduction by 2030. So important to pursue these opportunities. So switching to forests a little bit, obviously the boreal is a massive area, and it's globally significant. I mean, it's one of the largest remaining intact landscapes in the world, a massive area of wetlands, of rivers and freshwater areas, and as such, a critical ecosystem for many different species, and a huge provider in terms of the services that it provides, in terms of cleaning water, in terms of storing carbon, and in terms of protecting many species that are threatened. In terms of its carbon density, the boreal, as indicated here, stores twice as much carbon per hectare as the Amazon forest, and overall stores as much carbon as all of the world's known recoverable oil reserves combined. So it's a massive carbon sink. And as has been mentioned, it is the home and land and territory of hundreds of Indigenous communities across the country. So much of the boreal is primary forests, which means these are forests that haven't been significantly impacted by human activity. And as already mentioned, they're critical because they are massive stores of carbon. They have huge biodiversity value. They're also, and I think I've really only been kind of really digging into this in recent weeks, but I think there is significant evidence that primary forests are actually less susceptible to extreme wildfires for a number of reasons, and that replanted kind of monoculture forests post-logging are actually more likely to burn. So there's been a lot, I know, in the media about the logging sector kind of making the case that older forests are susceptible to burning, so we should log them, because then at least we're putting some of the wood into long-lived wood products and keeping it out of the atmosphere and getting some economic benefit from it. But I think that there's the the evidence goes quite against that, which is that older forests actually continue to sequester carbon and are, because of their ability to retain moisture and to maintain low temperatures, and a number of other characteristics, are actually less likely to burn. And even if we do cut them down and replant forests, those replanted forests are significantly at risk of fire as well. So we can talk more about that maybe in the discussion. And I guess the other point is just that primary forests are important in preventing floods, in preventing landslides, in also lowering temperatures, which protects us from extreme heat. It's interesting, you probably noted that the government doesn't use the word logging, and the industry certainly doesn't use the word logging. The word that's used is sustainable forest management, which is kind of interesting. I mean, you know, I don't think other sectors kind of always put sustainable in front of, maybe they do, maybe it is sustainable mining and sustainable agriculture, but I think certainly in the logging sector, you see the use of this sustainable forest management term. And if you take a look at Natural Resources Canada, kind of their annual State of the Forest report, you'll see that the claim is that there's basically very little deforestation in Canada. And it's partly because, you know, the picture on the right is not deemed to be deforestation. Deforestation is only when land use changes. So clear cutting is not deforestation because ostensibly this is still remains forest land. So it's partly a definitional issue that allows Canada to kind of claim that there's very little deforestation. But even so, there is permanent destruction of forests that takes place, which isn't really acknowledged and captured in the form of seismic lines and logging roads and logging landings, and Wildlands League has done really good work in terms of researching that. If you read the State of the Forest report, you won't see the word degradation. So there's no kind of real acknowledgement that clear-cut logging actually degrades forests in terms of their biodiversity value, their carbon value, etc. Sorry about this. And also in that State of Forest report, very little mention of the harm being caused to species. And finally, the portrayal of this massive industry as being carbon neutral. And that's the one I wanted to dig into a little bit. But first, Global Forest Watch does do some pretty good satellite-based assessments of tree cover loss in Canada. They found that there was more than 10% tree cover loss over the past 20 years in Canada. Some of that, of course, due to fires, some of it due to logging and any other industrial activity. But we do know that 700,000 hectares on average are logged each year in Canada, and about 550,000 of that is logged by clear cutting. And I was just tallying up from some of the government numbers in terms of what size an area has been logged. The numbers I had was between 1975 and 2015, and it worked out to half the size of Alberta. So that's a significant area of forest that has been logged in Canada over the last 40 years. And then Canada has on average lost more intact forest area than any other country in the world over the past 20 years, except Brazil and Russia. That's also according to Global Forest Watch. We know you've read about the threat, the declining populations of the boreal caribou, which relies on large areas of intact forest for their long distance migration patterns. And we know that only 15 of the 51 caribou ranges in Canada are thought to be sustainable in the long term for caribou. And we know that there are declines in caribou population in both Quebec and Ontario, and that the federal government has been monitoring that situation and pushing those provinces to do better in terms of protecting caribou. So I want to switch to really the area that Nature Canada has been focused on, and that's the greenhouse gas emissions associated with industrial logging. Part of the reason we looked into this was this chart is from the emission reduction plan, which was released in March, a year ago, March. And if you take a look at that plan, like it's, I don't know, it's 500 pages or something like that. But if you sort of look it over, you see that there's a pretty clear indication of what are the emissions for most large sectors of the economy. And I know that there are problems, and I know that methane emissions are vastly underestimated, but you know, at least there's kind of some attempt by the government to kind of say, well, here's the level of emissions from these sectors of the economy. Forestry, you know, we know it's a massive sector. We know that there's a massive area of forest that's logged each year. It doesn't appear in the breakdown of the emissions by economic sector. Instead, Canada uses different terms to describe or denote emissions from the forestry sector. So in their greenhouse gas inventory, they talk about net flux from managed forests and resulting harvested wood products. Use a different term, talk about forestry emitting in the emission reduction plan. They talk about human activities in Canada's managed forest. So first of all, it's the terminology is all over the place. Secondly, the numbers, as you can see, are kind of all over the place a little bit, but all of the numbers are kind of right around zero. So the other thing to note is there's no mention of kind of logging, or there's no separate reporting of what are the emissions that can be attributable to the industry, the logging industry, the wood product industry. That's not separately reported. So that's why we thought, let's ask the government for all the numbers that we need, and let's calculate it ourselves. And that's what we did in three reports. We issued 2 reports last year and then an update this year. And the work was really led by Matthew Bramley, who some of you may know was the head of the Pembina Institute climate program for many years. He has a PhD in math, just a brilliant guy who sadly passed away last year. But really the last project of his life was to just spend hours and hours digging through the government greenhouse gas inventories. And so he asked the question, well, what emissions, what greenhouse gas emissions and removals can be reasonably attributed to the logging industry? And he really came up with 3 elements. And one is, well, how much carbon is taken out through harvesting each year? So that's one thing, and the government has numbers for that. But all of that carbon doesn't go up to the atmosphere right away, right? Some of it, some of the wood goes into long-lived wood products, which keeps the carbon out of the atmosphere for decades. So we subtracted that amount, the net carbon added to long-lived wood products. And then the other aspect is that, you know, after most harvesting, logging, there is replanting that goes on. And those replanted trees sequester carbon. So he also reduced the number or subtracted the amount of carbon that's sequestered by regrowth after logging. And so carbon in harvested wood minus net carbon added to long-lived wood products minus removals from regrowth after logging equals net logging emissions. And what he got and what we got in this is from our more recent report using 2021 numbers, is that net logging emissions are 73 megatons in 2021, slightly less than oil sands operations, significantly more than electricity generation. So why does the government portray forestry as carbon neutral, and why do we believe logging is of the order of 70 megatons in emissions each year? And it all comes down to, gets us back to wildfires, comes down to the question of how does Canada account for emissions from natural disturbances? And what Canada does is quite different from other countries. Most other countries that we've looked at, northern countries, they do count the emissions from wildfires in their greenhouse gas totals. Canada doesn't. Australia is another one that doesn't. Canada makes the argument that these emissions shouldn't be counted because they're not directly human caused. They also make the argument that they shouldn't be counted because they change, they go up and down every single year. So they would mask the emissions that are directly attributable to human activity. So that's a couple of the arguments they make. We're, we don't have a strong opinion. We haven't kind of taken a position on whether Canada should count wildfire emissions. What we're deeply concerned about is that this problem is that they do not count wildfire emissions, but then they do take credit for some of the sequestration associated with regrowth after wildfires. So they're kind of having it both ways. They're not counting the huge emissions from wildfires, but then they're saying, well, we're going to credit the logging industry with, 80 megatons in 2021 of regrowth of mature trees after these wildfires, even though there's no direct human intervention. There's no reason that should be considered anthropogenic. And the UN is pretty clear. It allows countries to disaggregate, not count natural disturbances, but it says you have to do so in a balanced way. And if you look at the numbers in terms of how Canada is disaggregating, they're excluding about 100 megatons a year more of emissions than of carbon removals. So it's a very biased, unbalanced approach. And this is what is masking significant emissions from logging and making it look like on paper, the logging sector is carbon neutral. That's really the crux of the problem. And it's, you can imagine trying to explain that to the media or, to politicians. It's complicated, but it's not just us who's saying it. International scientists sent a letter to the Prime Minister last year, concerned about Canada's reporting approach and urging them to improve accuracy and transparency. And some of you may have noticed that the Commissioner on the Environment and Sustainable Development wrote a report on forests and climate change, released it in April. And he basically said the same thing. He said, it's unacceptable that Canada's not separately and transparently reporting emissions from the logging sector, just as it reports emissions from every other sector. Why isn't it reporting them from the logging sector? And also making the case that there's a need for an independent review of Canada's approach to measuring and reporting logging emissions. So more people are saying this, which is good, but we still have a ways to go. I don't want to talk too much longer, so I'm going to just try and wrap up with the last few slides. But I want to say this is a problem that Canada is not accurately and transparently reporting logging emissions for a number of reasons. It's a problem because it's allowing one sector of the economy to basically pollute for free, which increases the burden of emission reductions on other sectors of the economy. And it's a problem because climate policy needs to be based on solid evidence about emission levels. And right now, because the logging sector is kind of portrayed as being carbon neutral, it's portrayed as being a climate solution, and there are a whole ream of policies that are in place to actually expand logging and expand wood burning under the guise of it being a climate solution, because of the faulty math that underlies these policies. There's also no incentive for the logging sector to transition, to adopt lower carbon practices, and that's even
what we have been calling for is we think it's critical that the government clearly report emissions from logging. We're echoing the call from the Environment Commissioner for an independent review of Canada's practices of forest carbon accounting. And finally, we want to see an action plan for reducing emissions from logging, just as there are action plans for reducing emissions from other high emitting sectors of the Canadian economy in the emission reduction plan. Go to the next slide.
So this is opportunities to better protect forests.
Yeah, great. And really, just briefly, I think that in some ways we are at a watershed moment in terms of nature, the protection of nature. I think that you know, the government, federal government, does deserve some credit for advancing Indigenous-led conserved areas and Guardian program supporting Indigenous stewardship and restoration of landscapes. Clearly, there's not enough funding for those programs. There are many more Indigenous communities that could be playing leadership roles with adequate funding support. So that's certainly something we've been pushing for, is expanded investment. But I think that Canada is developing models of Indigenous-led protection, which are positive and need to be pursued. So I wanted to say that. And then I also wanted to just bring attention to the fact that Canada federally is in the midst of consultations on a biodiversity action plan to realize its commitment to halt and reverse nature loss by 2030. This is a huge opportunity to ensure that that plan is robust, that it's adequately funded, that it centers Indigenous people and Indigenous leadership, and that it addresses the destruction and degradation of landscapes, including forests. I already talked about the EU deforestation regulation. I do want to mention that there's a progress report that's being released on the emission reduction plan at the end of the year. I think this is an important opportunity to hold the government to account on its progress and lack of progress in terms of reducing emissions from various sectors of the economy. And so we see this as a critical time to hold them to account on their failure to even transparently acknowledge the high level of emissions from the logging sector. And then, of course, COP28 happening later this year, and the next Nature COP happening in 2024 are critical opportunities for to hold Canada and other countries to account. So I won't say much more about that. I think you can go to the next slide, please.
Okay, so it's what can you do?
Yeah. So I mean, these are just some initial ideas, but and a couple of links. But already we've mentioned the Day of Action tomorrow. Rallies happening across the country. I put as the first one, just contact your MP and ask them what they're doing to protect Canadians and protect our forests from the massively destructive fires that are taking place. This is a time to hold them to account. I've already mentioned the Canada's Biodiversity Plan. You can participate in that process at biodivcanada.ca. Obviously supporting the expansion of Indigenous-led protection, and join our network of 1,300 groups and over 200,000 Canadians, and keep in the loop. You can do that at naturecanada.ca. And there's one more slide, and then I'm done.
This is the conclusions.
Conclusions. Yeah. All right. So, I mean, just to reiterate very quickly, I've tried to make the case that the destruction and degradation of forests is driving both climate change and biodiversity loss, as is the destruction of other ecosystems, that we can't stop climate change unless we better protect forests and nature. Now is the time Canada needs to start strong action to halt and reverse nature loss, and that clear reporting of emissions from logging is central to both realizing Canada's climate targets, but also advancing the protection of Canada's globally significant forests. And of course, Indigenous people need to be at the front and center of efforts to protect, restore, and steward our forests, our wetlands, our grasslands, our coastal areas, as they have been doing for generations and generations. So I will leave it there, and I look forward to having some discussion and hearing your thoughts.
Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing and bring it back to the main meeting. So thank you for that. I really appreciate you taking the time to go through that in the detail that you did. And sorry for the technical problems that encountered in the course of doing that. As I mentioned before, there's a number of questions already that have been put into chat. But before we get to those, I'm going to call on two first questioners. The first one being Linda Ann Jewell from CAM, Climate Action Muskoka, to ask the first question to Michael tonight. So Linda Ann, are you there?
I am. Thank you, Gary.
Okay.
I have a quick comment first. Organizations like the Forest Stewardship Council have included Indigenous peoples in the decision-making process around sustainable forestry practices. And yet we're still in trouble in terms of environmental impact. Including Indigenous voices as mere stakeholders is clearly not enough. Here's my question. As it relates to industrial logging, what can activists like us be doing to ensure that Indigenous peoples and their traditional knowledges are leading the way with best practice? And what are those best practices, in your opinion?
Right. Yes. Well, thank you for that very good question. Yeah, I think that what we can be doing is we kind of, as I've already alluded to, I think that we need to be raising our voices to our government, showing appreciation for their efforts to center Indigenous leadership in conservation and restoration efforts, but to strongly make the case that the funding levels for those programs is inadequate. So, there was this old growth fund that the government announced, I think in budget 2022. I think it was $50 million. And that was to support protection of old growth forests in BC by Indigenous people. And I think that the immediate comment was that that is sort of too low by a factor of 10. And clearly, Indigenous people have the knowledge to steward, restore, protect forests, but they need the capacity and the resources to do that. So I think that the other piece is where Indigenous people have a lot of knowledge, and I haven't, I'm not an expert on this, but I know that I've read quite a bit talking about in other jurisdictions how Indigenous-led traditional practices for fire suppression have been very successful in, for example, Northern Australia, in cutting wildfire, the extent of wildfires by up to 50%. And Indigenous people have been provided resources and economic opportunities to act on and put in place traditional fire suppression techniques, and that's had huge potential. And I know there's some of that happening in Canada, but I think there's a huge potential for that to both benefit Indigenous people economically, but also benefit us all in terms of protecting us from wildfires. So I don't know, I think maybe I'd leave it there, except just to say that we can also show solidarity with individual nations in terms of the nations that are struggling against resource extraction projects that are harmful to our climate, are harmful to biodiversity, and are harmful to traditional ways of life. And I know that, the ones that kind of come to mind, I know that in Grassy Narrows, I think they just succeeded in getting a 10-year moratorium on logging in their territory. I know that Blueberry First Nation in BC, has successfully advocated for protection of forests there. And I know there's a big fight in the Broadback region with Waswanipi Cree in Quebec, trying to fight to protect their areas. So I think it's just being aware of where those struggles are and adding our voice in terms of contacting elected representatives, attending rallies. Certainly, another example is the Wet'suwet'en people and fighting against the Coastal Gas Pipeline. So lots of examples there. Anyway, I don't want to go on too long, so I'll maybe leave it there.
Okay, thank you for that, Michael. And now I'm going to turn over to Gail Greer, who's got for the second first questioner from Seniors for Climate Action Now. Gail?
Thank you, and thank you very much, Michael, and for all the work you and your associates have done on this. Your work and the attribution research that's being done these days, including the demonstration that 37% of the wildfires out west in the last I think 10 or 15 years have been due to anthropogenic causes and so on, demonstrate the need for regular independent reviews of the classification, measurement, and attribution of greenhouse gas sources and sinks, not just to prevent emissions underreporting, but also greenwashing. We can certainly hope that the NRC makes the reporting changes it has promised in 2024. But I'm curious to know whether or not any Canadian climate change legislation or regulation, such as the Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act or the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Standards, require such classification reviews. If not, is it a policy that SCAN and, Climate Action Muskoka, Environment Hamilton, and other environmental groups should really be pushing hard for? We certainly praise DeMarco's recommendations and so on, but is this a cause that we should be on the government for?
Yeah, thanks, Gail. Really good question. I think there has definitely been a lack of scrutiny and public accountability when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions from the logging sector. One problem is that for every other sector of the economy, ECCC, Environment and Climate Change Canada, is responsible for the kind of the measurement and the reporting of emissions. In the logging sector, Natural Resources Canada is the lead in terms of putting together the greenhouse gas emission numbers, and then they have a memorandum of understanding with Environment and Climate Change Canada. And there are good scientists at NRCan, but it is important to remember that, you know, part of NRCan's mandate is to promote the competitiveness of the various natural resource industries in Canada. So it's kind of put in this awkward position of being the overseer and also being the promoter from an economic standpoint of the industry. So one of the things we've argued for is that Environment and Climate Change Canada, just as it does for every other sector, should take primary responsibility for monitoring, quantifying, and reporting emissions from the logging sector. So that's just, I guess, one point. In terms of kind of transparency about greenhouse gas emission reporting, I mean, yeah, I think the environment commissioners played a bit of a role there. I do kind of agree that there aren't good accountability mechanisms in place. I don't believe that the Net Zero Accountability Act has anything really strong to say about that in terms of ensuring accountability and accuracy of measurement. We do have a variety of different bodies in Canada that kind of play that role, like the Canadian Climate Institute, the Net Zero Advisory Board. We've met with both of those organizations. We've, you know, kind of laid out the problem of this bias in reporting of logging emissions, where they just haven't taken it on yet. And I think part of the reason that NZAB hasn't taken it on is, you know, they kind of they do have industry reps around the table, reps from the logging sector around the table who, you know, I think have pushed back against this kind of scrutiny. So, you know, that's it is somewhat of a concern that there's not a kind of independent scientific body that is sort of ensures the public accountability of and accuracy of emissions reporting from all sectors of the economy. I think that's a bit of a deficit in Canada. And so, yeah, I would say we would love for any groups to be contacting Minister Guilbeault and Minister Wilkinson, and also be contacting those climate institutes like the Net Zero Advisory Body and the Canadian Climate Institute, and saying that you're deeply concerned about lack of transparency of reporting in this sector in particular, and to urge them to take a position on it.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for that. So in the chat box, there's a question with regard to glyphosate. I mean, with the wildfires being front and center in recent times, and you know, lots of urban centers being, you know, completely smogged out. The question arises as to what the role of you know, industrially applied from helicopters spraying the forest, what role that plays. You know, this is glyphosate spraying, and apparently what it does is it kills deciduous trees and that are competing with the preferred species, and therefore makes the forest more susceptible to wildfire. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this. You know, what are the ecological impacts of glyphosate spraying in forests, and including what the impact is on wildfire incidents?
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly aware of the issue. I know that groups like Sierra Club and Greenpeace have done work on it and spoken out against it. I'm aware that Jenica Atwin has put forward a private member's bill around this. So I am aware that there is an exacerbation of the risk of wildfires, and certainly great concern about the health impacts and wildlife impacts of the use of that herbicide. But you know, beyond that, I'm not an expert. I think it merits attention. I trust those environmental organizations that are putting more effort into it. We've kind of been a little bit obsessed with forest carbon accounting, so we haven't had the capacity to dig into all aspects of it. Maybe I'll just leave it there.
Okay, so there's another question having to do with provincial parks. And the question specifically is about the logging that's still taking place in Algonquin. I think that many people are surprised to learn about the amount of logging that takes place under multi-use kind of frameworks in places where we think they're protected, like provincial parks. So why the question is why is logging still permitted in Algonquin Park, and what's the significance of that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the ins and outs of that issue recently. I know that you know, groups like Wilderness Committee have been working on that. I agree that you know, people who've kind of been to Algonquin and gone into the canoe routes and the hiking routes and kind of gone into the bush just a little bit, you sort of see that there's kind of a green veneer along a lot of the lakes, and there's a lot of logging going on in sections of it. I don't really know the politics in terms of the compromise there that has been developed. I do know that environmental groups have been raising concerns about it, and it does seem like, you know, that's you know, here's a park visited by 1 million people each year, and one would think that it would be possible to protect it fully. But yeah, I can't really comment in more depth on it than that.
Okay, so Carolyn from Ottawa has got a question in chat about the percentage of logs that are actually exported from the country as opposed to being used for products that are domestic products. What's your sense of that? How much of the actual harvest in this country is exported to other markets outside of the country?
I don't have those numbers right in front of me. There's, you know, this is part of where the lack of transparency comes in a bit. I mean, I know that there, in the State of the Forest report, there's some sort of indication of exports in terms of dollars. There's not a very clear breakdown in either the National Inventory Report or the State of the Forest report about, I mean, you think it would be a fairly simple question. You know, how much wood coming out of forests goes into, you know, biomass wood pellets, how much goes into pulp and paper products, and how much goes into long-lived products. The emissions from those three uses are reported in the National Inventory Report. In the State of the Forest report, there's not really a lot of clarity about that kind of breakdown. So again, this gets us back to sort of transparency, but it's possible that those numbers are out there, but I haven't seen a clear breakdown.
Yeah, I know that at least I recall that the NRDC, the Natural Resources Defense Council, I believe, did a report on where the forest products extracted from the logs extracted from the forest, where they end up, what kind of products they end up, and they were talking about a large proportion of that ending up in products that were short-lived versus long-lived products. There's another question in chat having to do with, there seems to be a move to try to create longer-lived products that embody you know, lots of carbon and will sequester that for a longer period of time. And I, you know, was reference to the forest strategy in Ontario that the Ford government is promoting, you know, to try to increase the logging harvest, and using the rationale that they're going to emphasize long-lived wood products as opposed to the short-lived ones. So what's your take on that? Is that actually going to make a difference in terms of the sustainability of our forests? Is it going to do anything to change the carbon status, you know, of forests in Ontario in particular?
Well, I think it could. I mean, when I think about some of the changes that need to happen, I sort of think about, you know, there's a question of how much do we log? There's a question of where we log and what types of forests. and there's a question of how we log, clear cutting versus selective logging. And then there's a question of, well, how do we use the wood? How is the wood used once it has been logged? And so all of those are kind of levers that could affect the biodiversity impacts, could affect the carbon impacts of harvesting, of logging. But there just seems to be very little discussion about those various options, the policy options. And again, I've already said this, but I think there's very little discussion about it because there's just an assumption made that that the harvesting of wood is a carbon neutral process. And so there's no real need to think about ways to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions associated with that process. So I think that I think it would be good if there was more discussion about shifting away from using forests and using wood just to burn it, and shifting away from using logs and wood for toilet paper and tissue paper that's very short-lived, and more discussion about creating kind of robust recycled fiber networks, and shifting more harvested wood to long-lived wood products would certainly help us from a carbon perspective. I mean, if we continue to just clear cut forests, it's still going to be problematic because clear cutting causes such a massive initial release of carbon, because a lot of the carbon in the boreal forest is in the soils. So clear cutting, causes release not just from the wood itself in trees, but also from the soil. So anyway, that's some thoughts on that.
Okay, so there's a comment in the chat thing about wanting a link to some of the analysis done by Matthew Bramley. We do have a resource list that's going to be sent to everybody who registered for tonight's event, and that'll be coming out sometime tomorrow. And I believe that analysis, correct me if I'm wrong, Michael, that analysis is part of the of that resource list that I think the technical analysis that was done by you folks a while ago in 2021, I believe, was done by Matthew. And anyway, there's a link to that in the resource list that'll be coming out tomorrow. So stay tuned for that. There's also someone wants us to remember that there's an event being sponsored by Narwhal tomorrow about focusing on Jean Vallant's book on fire weather, largely about what happened in Fort McMurray and just the incredible kinds of circumstances that created and the significance of that fire in terms of where we're headed with a changing climate. And so there is a question attached to that reference to the Narwhal event that's happening tomorrow, which is to ask you whether or not you think that the forest industry itself recognizes the degree of threat that they're creating in the forest, that the increased threat, and if they do, what, if anything, are they trying to do about it?
That's a really good question. I mean, some of the statements I've seen from FPAC, the Forest Products Association, are along the lines of, I think some of what they've been saying I think is good, and I think they have been saying, recognizing the importance of Indigenous participation in traditional approaches to fire suppression. But I think some of what they've seemed to be saying is kind of using the wildfires, as I alluded to earlier, using the wildfires as sort of a rationale for increased harvesting and increased logging, and making this argument that once forests reach a certain age, they're not really sequestering much carbon, and they're, at risk of a stand replacing wildfire, and so we should log them. And I think that what that ignores is it ignores the biodiversity benefits of primary forests, which I talked about. It ignores that clear cutting is a very different process from a wildfire. It causes much more disturbance of soils, for instance, and a much more massive release of carbon. And then it also kind of ignores the fact, which I also alluded to, is that clear cutting and then replacing an old stand with a kind of monoculture stand, which could be treated by glyphosate and other chemicals, is not really a solution, because those replanted monoculture forests are also at high risk for burning through fires as well. So so I guess it's mixed, right? I wouldn't want to say I disagree with everything they're saying, but I think there are concerns that the industry is sort of using this as an opportunity to expand access and justify access to old growth primary forests.
Okay, we're getting close to 8:30, but there's a couple of questions I'd still like to try to get in before we call an end to the evening. But one of the questions has to do with whether or not Nature Canada has a list of current Indigenous protected and conservation areas that might be able to be circulated. So is there such a list that you have, and can we arrange to have that attached to the resource list?
I've certainly seen, I don't know if we have a kind of in-house list. I know that there are, I think there's a government kind of map of current Indigenous protected areas. I don't know if it's totally up to date. There were, 4 more that were announced at COP15. But I could take a look for the link, and maybe you could include that in your list of resources.
Okay, we'll attempt to do that. There's a question about biofuels and whether or not the use of forests to create biomass or biofuel products is actually captured in the official national greenhouse gas inventory.
Good question. Is it captured? Yes. The burning of wood combustion is captured in the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory. The problem, as people know, there's massive subsidies for biomass for energy and electricity and biofuels. And again, there's a problem because the assumption is that the wood pellets are produced in a carbon neutral way. We disagree strongly with that. I think that our whole analysis based on government numbers indicates that that's not the case. And so that's kind of skewing the analysis, which is making biofuel and biomass look more climate friendly than it actually is.
Okay, so someone, I think it was Moya Beal, actually mentioned that you were frozen in your presentation at the very moment that you were talking about the EU deforestation regulation. Can you quickly tell us why that's important and what it's about and why it's important?
Sure. It's a regulation that goes into effect, I think, later this week, and it basically bans the trade of, so especially the import of products that are associated with or that involve deforestation or forest degradation in the process of manufacturing or producing them. And why this is important is it's kind of an indication the EU is not the only country doing this. A couple of states, California and New York State, have been passing procurement laws or sort of in the process of passing procurement laws that would ban the state purchase of products that are associated with deforestation or degradation, or products that are produced without the consent of Indigenous nations. So what this is a message to the logging industry that increasingly markets are not wanting to purchase products that are exacerbating the climate crisis, exacerbating the destruction of biodiverse landscapes, and so you know, it's a message that not only is you know, transitioning it to a truly sustainable industry necessary from a climate and a biodiversity perspective and an Indigenous rights perspective, it's actually in the economic interests of these industries to ensure that they have access to markets that are increasingly discerning and increasingly restricting products that are causing harm to nature and climate. So I think that's why it's important.
Okay, so there's a question about whether or not there's an attempt afoot to sort of repurpose the paper and other cellulose sort of waste that comes off of the forest sector to use it for other products, but to reduce the consumption of you know, in the primary forest. What would you think the impact of that kind of effort is, and is it significant, and is it something that is, in your view, something that's worth pursuing?
So are we talking about companies moving away from the use of fiber that's coming from primary forests? I didn't totally understand the gist.
The actual question talks, and it's from Carolyn in Ottawa. She says, in the effort to replace plastics with wood source products, how much is being done in Canada to repurpose the existing boxes and paper packaging so no more trees need to be cut down?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, of course, there's been, you know, with the Amazon economy, there's been a massive increase in shipping and use of packaging materials. And I'm not kind of aware of efforts to reduce the kind of impact of those materials. I mean, I know that our partners, Natural Resources Defense Council, have done a lot of work with toilet paper tissue companies south of the border and have made some progress. They release a report card on U.S. companies in terms of their products and you know, how sustainable they are and how much they're contributing to the destruction of primary forests. So I know there's some market-based campaigns, and I know Canopy in Canada, people probably saw, maybe that's something to add to your resource list. There was an article in the National Observer a day or two ago, which was, I think some of you folks, the organizers, were circulating, just about how Canopy is working with companies to try and get them to move away from the use of so-called virgin fiber from primary forests in their products. So I think there is good potential for brand names to put pressure on brand names to be increasingly discerning in terms of where they're getting their wood fiber and paper fiber from. They can be part of the solution, certainly.
Okay, so I think I'll try to get one more question in. There's a question about the impact of a positive decision by the Competition Bureau investigation of forest certification programs' claims of sustainability. You're familiar with that. Is that environmental defense or eco-justice? I'm not sure which that made the complaint that resulted in that investigation. What's your take on that? Is that what would the significance of positive decision on that they have broken the Competition Act in their claims of sustainability?
Well, yeah, I am familiar with that case. I think it was eco-justice, and there's another organization involved too. But yeah, I mean, legally, the legal ramifications, I'm not 100% sure of that. But the political and kind of public ramifications, I think, would be very significant. I think that the more that various bodies are challenging the various myths about sustainable logging, the better. And you know, the more that the media shines a light on this, the better. And I know CBC did some good reporting on, you know, as part of this kind of international investigative journalist consortium around the real flaws in some of the, you know, third-party certification processes. And so I think it would be very important. And I know that, you know, just generally when it comes to climate change, I mean, just greenwashing is such a problem, right? Because these corporations have, you know, basically millions of dollars to spend portraying themselves as part of the climate solution when clearly they're not. And I know that other jurisdictions, like in Europe, I understand that they just passed a strong kind of anti-greenwashing bill, and I think that's hugely important. And I think the Canadian government should be pushed to do that as well. I know that there's some sort of review of the some consumer sort of protection act going on in Canada right now. I just can't remember the exact name of it. And I know that groups like Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment have been pushing, and I think eco-justice have been pushing for the review of that Competition Act. I think that's what it is, to really strengthen the regulatory power to shut down greenwashing that's increasingly taking place. So yeah, I think I totally support efforts to call companies to account for the mistruths that they're perpetuating.
Okay, so I think we're going to have to leave it there. We're now at almost 20 to 9. So I'm going to thank you once again, Michael, for your presentation and for your answers to the questions that your patience while we've gone through all those questions. And I want to sort of turn things back over to Sue McKenzie for some final thoughts.
Hi, first of all, I'd certainly like to give kudos to Terry and Michael for the great technical problem solving that they've done tonight. I'm so impressed. Terry, will you be sending the recording to registrants or Nick? That question was in the chat as well.
Yeah, the event is being recorded, and we'll be turning it into a posting on one or other of our YouTube sites as soon as we possibly can. So yes, it'll be made available, as will the slide deck.
So will the recording actually just be sent to the email of the registrants as well? I think that was the question.
The link to that will be sent directly to people.
Okay, great. So I'd like to thank Michael for taking us on this deep dive into the current lack of transparency and inaccuracies in the federal government reporting of GHG emissions from logging and from our forests. You've answered a question I've been wondering about over the last few days as to whether or not all these GHG emissions from the wildfires are being measured and included in government reports. And the answer seems to be no, they aren't yet, and that needs to be something we push for. I'd also like to thank all of you for joining us this evening. You can find the first webinar in the series on mineral extraction on our individual group websites. We hope you will see this, we'll see you this fall as well, when we continue the extraction series with agriculture and aggregates. So everybody, I wish you all a good evening and good night. Thanks for coming.
Thanks everyone for the discussion. Really appreciate you being here and the work that you're doing.
Thank you, Michael.
You, Michael, that was great.
Barry.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you, Michael.
My pleasure.